Thank you for those of you who've stayed for the discussion and Q&A. My name is Becky Jones. I work here at the Phoenix in the Marketing Department. And here today with me are three lovely ladies from De Montfort University. If you'd like to introduce yourselves.
Hi, I'm Melissa Clark. I'm from the Drama Department and very keen, if anyone would like it, to discuss some of the amazing performances that we've just seen in the film. Brilliant work by women on screen and Gloria Grahame's amazing performances being echoed there.
Hello, I'm Ellen Wright. I'm a lecturer in cinema and television history at De Montfort. I specialise in the representation of women in Hollywood from 1930 to around about 1960.
Hello, I've got my own mic. My name's Lorraine Porter and I'm film studies at De Montfort University also. It's my colleagues, of course. Is it switched on? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. And I'm interested in representation and the history of women in Hollywood and British cinema. So this is a really interesting film to kickstart some discussions, particularly with what's going on at the moment as well. I have to say this is a rather topical movie.
Yeah. So just starting us off before we open it out to anyone who's got any questions, is Gloria Grahame's experiences sort of representative of the experiences of other actresses during her career time, or is it more of a unique experience? We kind of got some of it alluded to her for Four Husbands and some of that as well, and seeing one of her films as well. But if you guys would like to address that.
I'm happy to kick it off, and I suspect we'll be passing it along the line. I think Gloria Grahame in many ways is a unique case. I think certainly this kind of sense of there being a turbulent private life bubbling behind, and people, critics, reviewers particularly more recently wondering whether that's appearing on the screen. That in and of itself is not unique. I think what is unique is that we have a very skilled performer whose performances have often been underestimated in her body of work from the end of the 1940s throughout the 50s. But also here we have a performer who was very sexually active, hinted at that in her performances on screen, and also someone who took a very active role in relationships generally in men and in determining what she wanted to do on screen. I think that in and of itself is unique.
I think her treatment by the industry is very typical, though. I think she's very much sort of used up and spat out in an awful lot of ways. That sort of idea of her being property of the studio, the way that MGM initially treated her. She was an MGM starlet, and they didn't really know what to do with her because she had this sort of very unique appeal. But I think, she sort of functions as a cautionary tale over and over again, the kind of characters that she plays, and her as a starlet as well, the way in which as she ages, she becomes problematic, because we all know as ladies we're not meant to get old and have our own ideas. And I think, the characters that she played as well, she's a very sassy lady in an awful lot of those films. And she's often punished quite heavily for that. Thinking about films like The Big Heat, certainly. So yeah, she's typical in many ways of the experience of a lot of women working in Hollywood. That sort of inherent misogyny.
Yeah, I think I'd agree there. And I think particularly, what does Hollywood do with older women? I mean, during, a lot of great actresses that had come through the 1930s and the 1940s, people like Bette Davis and someone like Gloria Swanson, for instance, they end up playing kind of slightly mad roles, like Whatever Happened to Baby Jane or Sunset Boulevard. So they can either go into kind of madness if they're still desiring older women. I mean, that's the problem, the older woman who desires. Or they get kind of character parts. And I suppose, what Gloria Grahame did was come to Britain to move into the stage because there were still roles that she could perform, because Hollywood had literally spat her out. Very short lifespan for actresses in Hollywood, particularly during this period. And I don't think the 1970s was a great decade for women in Hollywood, period. I mean, it's the period when we get the kind of a lot of slasher movies, very few women working in senior positions. I think Julia Phillips makes The Sting and produces Taxi Driver, but there's really not very much going on in Hollywood in the 1970s that would accommodate her, her skills. So I think she's very typical, very emblematic of her time as well.
Maybe what I might just add to that is, yeah, I would absolutely agree. This process of an actress having been exploited, having this very fallow period in the 1960s, although depending on what you read, there are interviews where she suggests that's of her choice, that it's a family decision to be at home further. But actually, there's also a sense in which we have actresses like Betty Davis or Joan Crawford being picked up, for example, recently in Freud performing in Trog. We have actresses performing in this kind of very interesting array of low-budget exploitation films in the 70s, as well as TV dramas. But actually there is a sense in which when you watch them on screen, they bring a weight to the performance. So yes, they might certainly be in a vehicle that doesn't do justice to their abilities, the skills that they've developed during their period in Hollywood, but actually they're offsetting what's on screen by bringing some gravitas, greater nuance to those performances. So I would encourage you to have a look at Gloria Grahame's IMDb credits and visit some of those later films, or YouTube explore some of the episodes of TV dramas that she appears in, because all of a sudden it's like, here is someone with real discipline and talent appearing on screen and demanding attention still to be seen.
All right. Does anyone have any questions they'd like to ask our panelists here about Gloria Grahame or film stars or anything like that?
How did you respond to the film? There's Matt over there, I think.
Oh, I was going to ask a question, but let's do your question first and we can come back to me.
No, I was just wondering how people responded to the film, and if anyone had anything to say, whether they enjoyed it, whether they found it informative or sad or tragic. Or
Well, you expect a sad ending though, don't you? I found it quite interesting because on several levels, because there's the younger man, which just nowadays in film it tends to be a much older male star with a much younger female star. So it was interesting in that, from that respect, but also for the fact that the lead is an older female star as well, and it's her story, and it's quite unusual to see those things in one film, never mind both in a film. So I found it quite interesting.
very much so. I mean, I'll just add to that one of the reviews I read, I think it was in The Guardian, I think it was Frank Cottrell Boyce, referred to it as an age-inappropriate relationship. You know, you have a 28-year-old man. Absolutely. You know, I mean, we never get it the other way. You know, it's so often we see it the other way round. There was a 28-year...
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. So, absolutely, I would agree wholeheartedly with you there.
And maybe I might just add that I read an interview with Annette Bening, who talked about actually having been, she just performed in The Grifters, where Stephen Frears had encouraged her to look at Gloria Grahame's films in the 1980s, and as a result had become fascinated with her work, had read Film Stars Don't Die in Liverpool when it came out, and had really wanted to play the role, but thinking about age inappropriate or appropriate performances, had realised she was too young to play it. So came back to it many years later. So you also have this sense of, yes, echoes of Gloria Grahame on screen, but also Annette Bening taking this very determined particular role as an older star. And I think, you know, there's also something else really interesting going on. So when Gloria Grahame's performing in theatre later in life, she's often billed in relationship to her performance in Oklahoma as the girl who just can't say no. And yet this is a film and indeed a book that's very much about a woman who is attempting to assert her rights by saying no. No, she doesn't want her family to come. No, she's not going to be ill. She's going to carry on performing. And there's something that's about a steadfastness that's coming with age, which signifies, I think, both the power from Gloria Grahame and Annette Bening on screen.
I think, Matt, you had a question.
Yeah, I think Gloria Grahame's a really fascinating figure because it seems to me, at least, and you may disagree, that she hasn't gone through the same rehabilitation process as a number of the other stars that you've talked about. So Betty Davis and Joan Crawford have, through things like Feud, but also more broadly than that, kind of returned to kind of prominence in more recent years. There's been kind of a broader public awareness of them, I suppose, as stars and of their work too. But Gloria Grahame hasn't undergone that really until this movie, and as great as this movie is, I don't think it's going to receive the type of broad public attention that would be necessary to return her to the public gaze. I wonder if you had any kind of sense of what's going on there, of why some stars in particular of that period, female stars of that particular period, have kind of gone through that rehabilitation process, and some kind of have not.
I do wonder if there's something here about there's something that the dad said in the film about the idea that Gloria Grahame is a man's actress, and stars like Joan Crawford, Betty Davis are women's actresses. So they perform in very particular sorts of films. And in a way, I think it's actually quite bizarre that somebody like Gloria Grahame gets overlooked, because there's this fascination with film noir, which is possibly, to my mind, the genre that she's most strongly associated. So it's like the uber cool genre, that when you teach film studies, that's what the students want to watch, and that's what you would like to teach. And she's so associated with that, yet, like you say, she does seem to be overlooked in a really interesting way. But I do wonder as well, I don't know if it's about the skill set that she possessed and the type of persona that she had. I think people are often quite surprised to learn that she was stage trained and she was from a theatre family. She was very, very skilled, in all sorts of interesting ways. This sort of assumption that she was maybe just a starlet. When you learn more about her, you realise that, like the stuff that Alyssa's saying about this skill set that she has, that's really quite actually impressive. I don't know if anyone else has anything they want to say.
I think it was also, there's something to do with the kind of roles that she was playing in her heyday in Hollywood. So unlike Betty Davis and Joan Crawford, she didn't always command top billing.
Yeah.
She had a number of cases, for example, when she was nominated for an Oscar for Crossfire, where she is playing the supporting role, or indeed where she actually wins the Oscar. So she's often someone who brings a real kind of dynamism, sass, to those supporting roles, but I think that often doesn't necessarily lead a straightforward path to rehabilitation, because she isn't the typical main star to be picked up. She is someone actually who is doing really careful, nuanced work at the sidelines. But saying that, there were reviewers at the time, so Truffaut, for example, who delivers this kind of really ecstatic review about her performance in Sudden Fear. So there's a sense in which maybe cineasts at the time were appreciating her performances, but perhaps that hasn't lasted in terms of popular audiences. Maybe.
And I think she died too young, really. I mean, she was only 57, 58 when she died. And if you think about it, that there's some of that rehabilitation for the older stars, like the Bette Davis is particularly, thinking of Katharine Hepburn. She stars in, she gets an Oscar, I think, is it for On Golden Pond in the is that 1981 or something like that? Or something. Anyway, I think she dies too young. So, she's kind of... she has her kind of fallow period at a really difficult time in Hollywood, I think. And then, had she lived longer, she might have been rehabilitated, as Hollywood then starts to, rediscover the importance of the older female actress who can bring so much gravitas to a role. And I think she completely missed out on all of that.
Did anyone else have sort of reaction to the film or some thoughts about it?
I came to this film not knowing anything about it at all. I was intrigued by the title, and I was completely bowled over by it, actually. I mean, the way that they portrayed the late 1970s and the early 1980s is exactly how I remember it. The big pattern wallpaper and the way that pubs were in the day as well. But this film, the performances were, I thought, were really amazing, particularly the Romeo and Juliet scene towards the end, and then really the goodbye at the end as well had me in tears. So, I from an emotional level, it was a really wonderful film for me.
Anyone else got any more thoughts on the film? How do you respond to it?
I
I wonder if anybody in the panel had anything to say about the way that theatre and film work in this film. I'm speaking as a drama person, but it's one of the things that really stood out for me in this is the way that, because that's so often such a difficult relationship between sort of live theatre and recorded film. And in this film, for me, it seems to kind of bring these things together, or has a kind of dialogue between them. And I wonder if anyone had anything to say on that at all.
Well, I think it's it's written through, it's a kind of autobiographical tale written by Peter Turner, who is himself an actor. So I think in a sense there is always the sense that the theatre, I think, is seen as the authentic, the aspirational. That's where she wants to be in the RSC. So I think the British theatre is probably seen as a site of kind of talent and authenticity and so on and so forth. And I think Hollywood, particularly at the time, was probably seen as a little bit second rate. So I think the theatre is seen as something she aspires to, and certainly the British theatre. And I'm not sure, because I really don't know whether she couldn't get theatre roles in America, why she came to Britain. I haven't read the book, so I can't answer that. So maybe either of you want to say that?
Maybe we both can. I want to say, just I suppose in response to your point, it feels in parts of the film like a space is given for people to make theatrical entrances and exits, whether that's through kind of billowing curtains, framed by the door, even sometimes framed by the wardrobe. There's a sense in which they each have their mini stage to perform on. There's a moment where Jamie Bell kind of turns away and we can see he's trying not to cry, and it feels like a moment on stage before someone's about to deliver their soliloquy potentially out to the audience. And yes, I think there is that real sense of being seen through an actor's lens. I also think, so in terms of the point maybe that Lorraine was raising, this kind of relationship between potentially theatre and Britain as a site of authenticity. There's a really nice review with Peter Turner, who we see on screen very briefly. He's the stage manager who brings the chairs on during the Romeo and Juliet scene. Where he refers to potentially Gloria Grahame having a kind of bucket list and performing for the RSC being one of those things, and potentially that link with her mother. There's also really nice in the book, a really nice moment where he talks about her mother coaching her for roles that she performed on screen and likening different roles that she performed on screen to different Shakespearean characters. So Lady Macbeth is one. Interestingly, in this film where we're having age kind of really flagged up, Romeo and Juliet's the one that's picked out. In the autobiography, he refers to Lady Macbeth as being the role she really wants to get her teeth into.
I kind of have an American perspective. For some reason in America, when it comes to sort of acting and celebrities, it's a lot more isolated, whereas in Britain it seems very fluid. Actors traverse the realm of film and television and stage a lot more easily, it seems to me anyways, compared to the States, where if you act on stage, that's where you act. You don't really know a lot of stage actors unless that you're into the theater in America, of our American actors. If you act on television, you tend to just stay in television. And if you act in film, you act in film. And if you go from film to television, you can guest star. Or if you get a television series, it's almost like you've lost out because now you're in television. And if you go onto stage, barely anyone's going to hear that you've done it. Or you'll sell out seats because they'll be like, oh, so-and-so is in this production. But it doesn't have the same kind of fluidity over here where it doesn't seem to it's no insult to them if they act on stage or in a film or in television. It's almost all entirely equal, which I think might be why she came to Britain, because had she tried to get work on the American stage, it doesn't have that same sort of feel to it that I think you get over here in Britain, where you get that sort of respect and it's not an insult or having gone down a peg to act on stage.
I was just going to add that it's really interesting the roles that she's been offered to perform in as well. So we see her initially, she's performing in Rain, which also appears on screen as Miss Sadie Thompson. So again, there's a kind of the types of characters that we know her for on screen. One character refers to it as the tart, but I would say maybe the nuanced knowing woman are the roles that she's being offered in theatre or Glass Menagerie. So ideally that kind of relationship in Tennessee Williams's plays in female characters between that knowingness and vulnerability is also being something we recognise in terms of Gloria Grahame. So there is a fluidity in terms of persona on screen that's then appearing on stage that she's being cast for.
I guess that's going to kind of appeal to British audiences as well, isn't it? That they might recognise the name Gloria Grahame. It's a very particular set of appeals she offers, and again the dad articulates that set of appeals. The idea about the lips, and you're going to get sore lips as you walk home with her. So the audience are going to possibly make those sets of associations and be attracted to come and see her, see how she works in that sort of stage environment potentially, maybe.
I guess there's also I'm just going to add that sort of, we really get a sense of the love between the characters, actually even more so than in the book, which is written from a slightly distanced perspective. But there's a real sense of passion, of love, of desire for the other person, and sometimes they use a kind of theatrical lens, like the Stella moment, to really point to that, to highlight it. So it becomes another way in which they can communicate each other and also recognise each other's lives as fellow actors.
Yeah. I think the authenticity of the stage that the film promoted is a little cliche, perhaps. That's the common perception, if you like. That Hollywood is kind of all glitz and glamour and the stage is authentic. But the film is pretty unforgiving to the older actress. I mean, it shows every wrinkle in Annette Bening's face because it's shot largely in close-up. And of course the stage doesn't have close-ups. So she can put on her false eyelashes and her makeup and her lipstick, and she's able to play roles like Sadie Thompson, which is actually too old for, because she can be perceived as younger on the stage.
I know what you mean, but actually I thought it was really good to see Annette Bening's wrinkles. That she's actually very beautiful and characterful, and I think her face is really interesting. And I thought there were times when I thought, yes, maybe the camera's cruel, but actually no, it's not. It's showing a woman for what she is of that age, and she's not had lots of plastic surgery. That's evident. And I guess I thought, what's the problem with that? Why can't women be what they are at that age? Why can't they be? Why can't they show their lives in their face? And I think she has got an incredibly beautiful face, but again, it's not had those wrinkles ironed out. And I thought I was really glad about that, actually.
Yeah, it made it feel so much more genuine than if she'd somehow been smoothed out.
I suppose the point that we know is that Gloria Grahame herself had quite a lot of plastic surgery. So that's an interesting counterbalance. But we have also those moments on screen where we see Annette Bening through a kind of rosy glow or through the veil of a curtain, as though we're seeing her, I suppose, at those points through Jamie Bell's eyes. And I guess later on, when we begin to see her in kind of harsher and harsher close-up, it's also about the fact that she's not just an aging female star, but she's a dying woman. So there's a kind of bravery, courageousness and rawness that's coming from Annette Bening's performance there as well.
Any other questions or comments?
I think just on that point, there was something quite nice about the way that the camera treated her face, particularly in those close-ups, in that it was actually quite blasé about it. There was no kind of... there were the moments where she was kind of putting, at the very start, where she's putting on her false eyelashes and so forth, where you see her face in kind of extreme close-up, but it's very functional. It's very kind of, this is her putting on her lipstick, this is her putting on her false eyelashes. And later on, even when he was dabbing her lips, it was very much kind of, he's caring for her now. So all of that kind of close-up material wasn't, to me, saying, look at her aged face. It was simply kind of this is what's happening now. Like, this is what's occurring to her face, and you have to see that. So here's the close-up, which is very much how kind of male faces are shot. Aged male faces are shot. It's not kind of in a look at this aged face. It's just kind of here's a face for you. So I thought there was something quite refreshing about the way that the camera treated her face in this. It felt very much like the way that we would shoot older male faces. And conversely, actually, the way that the camera treated Jamie Bell and his body was very much how the camera often treats younger women's bodies, which, you know, I appreciated for once, but also was full of problems in its own right too. But I think there was something quite kind of tricksy going on there with the way the camera watches.
For me, there's also something, we start with seeing her put on her makeup. So that functional side is also about demonstrating her labour, the investment in her role as a performer, so that we can see not just skill and discipline at work, but something that she's, you know, a technique, a ritual before she performs that she's taken years of honing and is returning to. There's that reference later on in the film about the fact she didn't have chemotherapy because she was frightened she lost her hair. And there's a sense of, okay, yes, vanity is at play there, understandably, but she's also aware that she loses her value as a performer, someone to be traded in without that hair. And she needs to carry on working. She doesn't have very much money. We see how few clothes she has, where she chooses to live. So she needs that work. She needs to be able to trade herself in many different ways on that basis. Although, I suppose we might then think of Humphrey Bogart, who also died of cancer and performed with a toupee that many people knew about later in life. So one rule for him and not for her.
If that is all questions tonight, I'd like to thank our panelists for coming in and discussing, and I hope you all enjoyed the film. Thank you very much for coming, and if you join me in a round of applause for...